Sometime in the last few days, you caught sight of the date and felt a small lurch. Not alarm exactly, just the sense that the number was further along than it had any right to be, as if a whole stretch of the year had slipped by while you were facing the other way. You did the quiet arithmetic, and you were right. It really had been that long. It happens more than it used to. You drive a familiar road and arrive with no memory of the drive itself. You notice that a child you know has grown a full size since you were last paying attention, though you'd have sworn that was a couple of months ago and not a year. You reach for something on a high shelf, a box, a coat, a tangle of last winter's lights, and the last time you touched it feels like a few weeks back, except the calendar insists it was 12 months and a whole season ago. And now, it's late. The house has gone quiet, and you're lying in the dark with the particular clarity that only seems to arrive at this hour, once the day is finally behind you. Almost without meaning to, you find yourself wondering where all of it keeps going. It wasn't always like this, and you know it wasn't, because you can still reach back and find the opposite. A single summer from when you were young that seemed to last about a decade. One August that held entire civilizations of boredom and invention, where the afternoons ran so long they seemed to have their own weather. A week was a genuine unit of time back then. A year was practically geological. You were living by the same clock you live by now, on the same turning earth. And somehow, then, it was an ocean, and now it's a stream you can step over without wetting your feet. That's the strange part, if you stop on it for a moment. The clock itself hasn't changed. A year is 365 days, whether you are 7 or 47. The same stretch of time that once felt vast can now feel like almost nothing, and the difference isn't in the time at all. It's somewhere in you. This is the kind of thing that has quietly humbled some very serious people. A man 16 centuries ago confessed that he knew perfectly well what time was, right up until the moment someone asked him to explain it. And then he found he had nothing in his hands at all. Someone much closer to our own age noticed that the years of a life seem to thin out and fold into one another the longer you live, until whole decades go missing somewhere. And there are people right now, tonight, with machines that first man could never have dreamed of, still trying to settle what is actually happening. And still, for the most part, disagreeing with one another. So you are in good company here, lying in the dark, wondering where the time went. It turns out the wondering is one of the oldest things about you. And underneath the wondering, there's a quieter possibility, one that doesn't quite leave you alone once you've let it in. Maybe the speed of a year was never really a fact about the year at all, but a fact about you, about how much of it you were actually here for, and that turns the whole thing over in your hands. It stops being only a question about where the time goes, and becomes something nearer the bone, a question about where you go while it is passing. Before we follow that any further, one small thing. If a channel that sits quietly with questions like this is something you'd want more of, subscribing does more to keep it alive than you would think. And down in the comments, I'd genuinely like to know, what is one ordinary day from your childhood that still feels enormous to you? Not a birthday, not a holiday, just a regular day that for some reason refused to shrink. And do you have any idea why that one survived? I read them, and that question tells me more than any study has. For now, though, there is nothing here that needs solving. The house is quiet, it's later than it was, and the question has already waited 1,600 years. It can surely wait while you rest. So let your shoulders come down from wherever they've been holding on all day, and let's go back to where you actually started a few minutes ago, without noticing, to that one endless summer where the afternoons had their own weather and a single ordinary day could hold more than a whole year seems to hold now. There was an afternoon somewhere back in your childhood that simply would not end. You probably couldn't put a date to it. It wasn't a birthday or a trip or anything that earned a place in the official record of your life. Just a long, ordinary afternoon in a long, ordinary summer, the kind there seemed to be hundreds of, and yet some of it is still in you. The slant of the light going slowly gold against a wall, the particular boredom so deep and shapeless that looking back, it reads less like boredom than like sheer space, more hours than you had any idea what to do with. Dinner was impossibly far off. The evening passed, it was practically another country. A single day at that age had rooms in it. You could walk into one in the morning and come out somewhere else entirely by dark. You knew this kind of time intimately back then, even if you couldn't have named it. It was there in the back of the car on a long drive when, "Are we nearly there?" was less a question than a sincere measurement of suffering, and 10 minutes was an ordeal with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It was there in the last week before a birthday, which lasted roughly a geological age. It was there in a single school year, which felt, while you were inside it, like a decade you would never quite finish serving. Time had weight and texture then. There was an almost unbearable amount of it. That feeling, that childhood ran longer and slower than whatever you're living in now, is so common it's nearly the first thing people say about getting older. And a little over 100 years ago, someone sat down and tried to explain why. His name was William James, and in 1890 he published a book on the workings of the mind that still reads less like a textbook than like a thoughtful man arguing quietly with himself late at night. He wasn't the first to feel what you felt on that endless afternoon. Nobody is ever the first to feel this, but he may have been the first to write it down so cleanly. As a child, he observed, you can have an entirely new experience almost every hour. Everything is happening for the first time, your attention is wide open, and so your memory of those years comes back to you as something, in his exact words, intricate, multitudinous, and long drawn out. Crammed, in other words, stuffed full of event. But with each passing year, he went on, more and more of your life quietly turns into routine you barely notice while it's happening, and so the days and the weeks smooth themselves out in recollection to contentless units, and the years grow hollow and collapse. Think of how much of childhood is made of firsts. The first time you saw the sea, or stood in snow, or understood a joke that wasn't meant for you. The first time you stayed up late enough to find out what the house felt like after midnight. Each of those carved itself in deep because the mind pays its closest attention to whatever it has never met before, and a year built almost entirely out of first times records itself in enormous, vivid detail. That's the engine underneath what James saw. Novelty is what makes time feel full, and childhood, whatever else it was, is the part of your life when the largest share of everything was still happening for the very first time. You know the truth of this from the far end, the adult end. A whole comfortable week can pass now in a kind of soft blur, and when you reach back for it a month later, there is almost nothing there to take hold of. Childhood felt vast on this account, for the plain reason that you were laying down memory more or less constantly, recording in high detail the way you only do when the world is still new to you. The long afternoon felt long because it was thick with the new, and the years thin out later on, not because the hours got shorter, but because you mostly stopped writing them down. It's a lovely explanation, and it carries the deep ring of something true. It has been quietly believed for well over a century. But this is where it starts to get genuinely interesting and a little bit unsettling, because when researchers finally stopped theorizing and went out to measure the thing, it turned slippery in their hands. They asked hundreds of people from the age of 14 to the age of 94 whether time seemed to be picking up speed, and the feeling turned out to be almost perfectly universal and, at the very same moment, surprisingly hard to pin to anything solid. Yes, nearly everyone agreed that the years go faster than they used to. But when those same people were asked to judge an actual hour, an actual day, an actual week, the differences between the young and the old shrank to something far smaller than the feeling had promised. The one place the sensation showed up sharp and undeniable was the big, blurry, backward glance. That quiet gut punch of a question you can ask at almost any age past 30. Where did the last 10 years go? So we find ourselves in a slightly odd position this early in the night. The feeling is real, too widely and stubbornly shared to be anyone's private trick of the mind. The tidiest explanation for it is at least partly true. And yet the thing itself, once you put it under a good light and actually measure it, turns out to be smaller and stranger than it feels from in here, in the dark, at this hour. The feeling is enormous, and the fact, once measured, is oddly modest. And the distance between those two is, more or less, the whole of the mystery we're sitting with tonight. Which brings us back, one last time, to that afternoon. Hold it for a second longer before you let it drift. Here is the genuinely strange thing about it. It is, at one and the same time, the longest and the shortest thing you own. The longest, because back then it really did contain more lived time than an entire month of your life seems to hold now. More hours that counted, more that was happening for the first time. And the shortest, because the whole of it, every one of those uncountable golden hours, now fits into a few seconds of remembering. You can replay the entire endless afternoon in the time it takes to breathe out once. Both things are completely true. The afternoon hasn't shrunk and it hasn't grown. You've only moved to a place from which the whole of it is visible at a glance, and from here the most spacious day of your childhood is smaller than your own hand held up in the dark. Let your breath settle on that for a moment. There is nothing here to grip. The afternoon is yours now, whatever else becomes of the years. It has already lasted, in its own strange way, forever. And yet, the mind, even this far toward sleep, doesn't much like a mystery left lying open on the floor. It wants a clean reason, something it can close its hand around. And as it happens, a famously tidy one has been waiting all along, a single, elegant line of arithmetic that looks at first glance as though it might settle the whole question on its own. Here is that line, and it is so clean you will want it to be true. It comes down to a single fraction. When you are 5 years old, 1 year is a full fifth of everything you have ever lived, an enormous, unignorable slab of your whole existence. By the time you are 50, that same year is 1/50th of your life, a thin shaving off a very large block. The year itself hasn't changed at all. Your life has simply gotten bigger, so the year measured against it has gotten proportionally smaller. And a smaller seeming year, the idea goes, is exactly what time speeding up would feel like from the inside. It is a seductive little theory, and it's easy to see why it has travelled so far. It has the feel of arithmetic, which makes it sound like a law of nature rather than a hunch. And it explains the shape of the thing almost perfectly. Why the distance between feeling 5 and feeling 10 was a wide plane you crossed at a walk, while the distance between 43 and 48 is something you can barely feel pass beneath you. Each new year is a smaller percentage of the total. Draw it on a graph and you get a smooth curve, time appearing to gather speed, every year worth a fraction less than the one before, exactly as experience seems to report. You can feel the pull of it every time a birthday comes around. They arrive faster now, the birthdays. You've barely grown used to the new number before it changes again. As a child, the wait from one to the next was almost unbearable, a whole season of longing. Now the years queue up and pull in 3 at a time, like buses after a long gap. Of course they do, says the theory. Each one is a slimmer slice of the whole than the last. The wait feels shorter because, measured against the life you're holding it up against, it genuinely is shorter. It is also almost certainly wrong, and the sharpest evidence against it comes from the very place that made it famous. The proportional idea is usually traced to a French philosopher named Paul Janet, who proposed it back in the 1870s. But the reason any of us remember it is that William James, the same James from before, copied it into his great book in 1890. Sit at his desk with him for a moment. He writes the formula out carefully. He can see its elegance as plainly as you can. And then, almost in the same breath, he sets down his pen and waves it away. The formula, he says, roughly expresses the phenomena, but it cannot possibly be an elementary psychic law. The man who preserved the neat answer for the rest of us did not, himself, believe it was the answer. Why back away from something so satisfying? Because once you look closely, the formula quietly assumes something faintly absurd, that somewhere beneath your awareness you are forever dividing, taking each new day and weighing it against the entire accumulated length of your life, the way an accountant sets a single expense against a lifetime's earnings. But that isn't how any of it feels, and it isn't how a single one of us actually lives. You don't experience this morning as 1/17,000th of your existence. You experience it as this morning, the coffee, the grey light, the things you have not done yet. We live hour to hour and day to day, not life fraction by life fraction. The arithmetic describes the curve beautifully and explains the living of it, not at all. It is a careful picture of the symptom, dressed up in numbers and handed to us as the cause. When researchers in our own time went looking for that clean, proportional curve, really tried to find it in how people judge the passing of time, it wasn't there, or at least not nearly as tidily as the theory needs it to be. The differences between younger and older people turned out smaller and messier than a strict 1/your-age ratio would demand. And stranger still, when they searched for what actually predicts that racing feeling, age itself kept sliding down the list, quietly outranked by other things entirely. So the clean answer leaves us not with a solution, but with a better question than we started with. The proportional theory got one thing right, even as it came apart. The feeling really is relative. A year does feel like a fraction of something. It was only wrong about what. It assumed the year was being weighed against the sum of all your years, and that, it turns out, is a fiction nobody actually inhabits, which leaves the real question, the one the arithmetic blundered into on its way to falling apart, looking quietly enormous. If a year is a fraction, then a fraction of what? What is this year being measured against exactly that makes it feel so much lighter than the years you still carry around inside you? It's a fitting thing to be left holding at this hour because arithmetic is one of the very first faculties to dissolve as you drift towards sleep. The part of you that counts and divides and keeps the books is already loosening its grip tonight. You can almost feel it setting down its work, and the question, once it slips free of the numbers, doesn't get any smaller. It gets stranger and somehow more alive. The arithmetic has said its piece and quietly excused itself, but James, even in the act of crossing the formula out, was already pointing somewhere else, not at the sheer length of a life, but at what a life actually manages to hold on to. The thing a year gets weighed against may not be the calendar at all. It may be memory, how much of the year you still have in your hands and how much of it simply moved through you and left nothing behind to prove it was ever there. If a year is really being weighed against what you remember of it, then memory is where the strangeness lives, and memory keeps time in a way that makes the calendar look almost honest by comparison. Think back to the last time you went somewhere genuinely new, even for only a few days. While you were inside it, the time most likely raced. Good days have a way of emptying out before you are ready for them to end. The first morning in an unfamiliar city, streets you didn't know yet, a meal you'd never tasted, and then somehow you were packing again. And yet now, from a distance, that short trip has swollen in your mind. It sits there as a broad, deep stretch of living, far larger and more vivid than the 8 or 9 ordinary weeks that followed it and have already closed over without a sound. A handful of days outweighs 2 months. That is the paradox you actually live inside, and it quietly makes nonsense of the idea that time is just a count of days. The way through it is to notice that you are not keeping one clock but 2, and they measure entirely different things. There is the time you feel while you are living it, minute by minute, and there is the time you tally up afterward when you look back and judge how long a stretch was. Call them the lived clock and the remembered clock. They rarely agree because they run on different fuel. The lived clock runs on attention. When something takes hold of you, a new place, a real conversation, work that absorbs you completely, you stop watching the time and it pours away fast. When nothing holds you, when you are bored or waiting or stuck, your attention falls back onto time itself and the minutes grow thick and slow. The remembered clock runs on something else entirely, not attention, but memory, the sheer quantity of new and distinct material a stretch of time managed to lay down. A period crowded with the new reads, in hindsight, as long and full. A period that left almost nothing reads as short, no matter how many days it actually swallowed. Hold the two clocks side by side and the paradox simply dissolves. The trip raced while you lived it because it had all of your attention, and it looms large now because it left behind a thick seam of new memory. The ordinary weeks felt unremarkable as they passed, and they have shrunk to nearly nothing in recall because they deposited so little. The same route, the same lunch, the same screen, 1,000 soft variations on a day you had already lived 100 times. The boring afternoon that crawled past your desk is, a month later, simply gone, while the difficult conversation that was over in 20 minutes is still right there, life-sized, whenever you reach for it. This is why our everyday sayings about time flatly contradict one another, and why all of them feel true. Time flies when you're having fun is the lived clock, attention pulled outward, the evening gone in a blink. A watched pot never boils is the lived clock again, only bored this time, attention pinned to the crawling seconds. And when someone sighs and asks where the years went, that is the remembered clock, looking back over a stretch that left too little behind to fill the space. They were never really in contradiction. They are simply reports from two different instruments, each one honest about the thing it was built to measure. This, far more than any fraction, is why the years seem to gather speed, and it is the grown-up echo of that endless childhood summer, the very same machinery running in reverse. Back then, almost everything was new. The days recorded themselves in rich detail, and time felt vast. Now, a rising share of your days are near copies of days already lived. The mind barely troubles to write them down, and a year built mostly out of those is a year with almost nothing in it to look back on, which is exactly the feeling of time having flown. There is something quietly unsettling in this, once you let it land. The weeks that vanish are not, for the most part, the bad ones. The hard weeks, the frightening ones, the weeks when something broke or something began. Those stay. They keep their edges and their dates. The weeks that disappear are the smooth ones, the comfortable and frictionless weeks that felt, while you were inside them, perfectly fine, pleasant even. The very ease that you spend so much of your life trying to arrange turns out to be the texture of time that leaves the least behind. We work hard for more smooth weeks, and the smooth weeks are precisely the ones that, looking back, were barely there at all. You may already have lived through the largest demonstration of this that anyone has ever accidentally run. During the long stretches of lockdown a few years ago, novelty collapsed for almost everyone at once. The days lost their edges and the week lost its shape until people genuinely could not say whether a stretch had been 3 days or a month. Many described living inside one endless, repeating day, a single grey blur's day that refused to break into parts. That was the two-clock machinery laid bare on an enormous scale. Nothing new to catch the attention, nothing distinct to set down in memory, and time, starved of both at once, going quietly haywire. You can feel a miniature of the same thing on any evening you lose an hour to the small, glowing rectangle in your hand, absorbed enough that the hour empties out while you live it, yet so featureless that it leaves nothing behind. An hour that manages to disappear twice. So where, then, did all those weeks go? It may be the wrong thing to ask of them. Memory was never a vault built to keep everything that ever happened to you. It behaves more like a mirror, holding only what is vivid and sharp enough to leave an impression on the glass. The dull days fog it for a moment with their breath and clear again by morning. The vivid ones etch themselves in and stay. And there is a quiet kind of peace available in that, if you are willing to take it. The recognition that a life was never meant to be a complete recording of itself. The smooth weeks did their work. They rested you and carried you, and then they let themselves be forgotten, which is not at all the same thing as having been wasted. So the question of where they went doesn't really want answering. It would rather you noticed, while you still can, which of today's hours left a mark on the glass and which only fogged it for a breath and cleared. You can carry that down into sleep with you tonight, and the mind will go on sorting it in the dark the way it always does, keeping a little, letting most of it go, deciding entirely on its own what was worth holding on to. You are halfway down the stairs when your foot finds nothing where the next step should be, and in the sliver of time before anything else happens, the world does something extraordinary. It slows almost to a stop. You seem to have time, actual, usable time, to watch your own hand reach for a banister that is just too far away, to register the floor tilting up to meet you, to think, with a peculiar and almost leisurely calm, this is going to hurt. The whole thing can't have lasted more than a second, but from the inside, it unfolded slowly and with room to spare, as though that single second had been quietly pulled open like a drawer and you had been handed all the time you could possibly need. Almost everyone carries a version of this. The car that pulled out, and the long, strangely calm moment you had to watch it come. The glass that left your hand and seemed to fall for whole minutes. The skid, the stumble, the near miss, and that uncanny dilation, the sense that in the worst instance the mind shifts up into some higher gear and buys you a little extra time to act. It is one of the most convincing experiences a human being can have. It feels like proof written directly onto the nervous system that the speed of time is something the brain can change, that there is a dial in there somewhere and that fear knows how to turn it. And there is real reason to take that seriously, because the brain does appear to keep something like a clock, not a single tidy timepiece, but circuitry that measures out seconds and minutes, and that can plainly be tuned. You can almost watch the dial move. Give someone a stimulant and a held minute will feel longer than it truly is. The inner clock racing ahead, counting off more beats than the world actually delivered, so that the real minute, when it finally ends, feels overdue. Calm that same chemistry, the dopamine tied up with reward and wanting, and time pools and thickens instead. The clock is real, and the clock can be nudged. There is also a bolder idea, much shared lately, with the seductive quality of seeming to explain everything in one stroke. It comes from an engineer rather than a brain scientist, which is part of its charm and part of its trouble, and it goes like this. The aging brain takes in the world a little more slowly, gathering fewer fresh images in each passing second than a young brain does. And if you register fewer of those mental snapshots in a given minute, then that minute in passing will seem to have gone by faster. Less happened in it, by the only measure the mind has. Childhood runs slow and deep because the young brain is sampling reality at a frantic rate. The years speed up because the sampling quietly slows down. It's elegant, it feels physical and inevitable, and it has been passed around everywhere as the reason time flies. There was a way to test at least the dramatic part of this, and a neuroscientist named David Eagleman went looking for it. He reasoned that if terror genuinely shifts perception into a higher gear, if your eyes and brain really do speed up in the moment, then a frightened person ought to be able to see things too fast for ordinary vision to catch. So he built a small wristband that flashed numbers just slightly too quickly to read, faster than the eye can normally resolve them, and then he arranged for volunteers to be properly, helplessly afraid. One at a time, they were dropped backward off a tower, 150 feet straight down into a net below, falling for about 2.5 seconds, long enough to be genuinely terrifying, short enough to walk away from. On the way down, they tried to read the flickering numbers on their wrists. If perception had truly accelerated, the flashing would slow just enough to become legible. Not one of them could read it. Their vision during the fall was no quicker than it had been standing safely on the platform. And yet, afterward, when each was asked how long their own fall had lasted, they judged it about 1/3 longer than the falls they had watched other people take. Their eyes had done nothing unusual at all. Time had not slowed for them as they dropped. The stretching was added later on the way into memory. Because terror records itself with extraordinary density, and a densely recorded event, played back afterward, feels as though it simply must have taken longer to happen. Time slowing, Eagleman concluded, is a function of recollection, not perception. The slow motion was real enough. It had only never happened during the fall. It happened in the remembering of it. There is an odd comfort in that once the small disappointment of it passes. Nothing in you failed on the stairs. Your mind did not bend the world and then fumble the trick. Memory simply did the thing it is built to do. It pressed down hard on a dangerous moment so that it would stay with you. And the stretched, slow-motion time was the mark that pressing left behind. The same remembered clock from before, only cranked now to its highest setting. The densest memory a body can make turns out to feel like the longest stretch of time. Fear doesn't slow the world, it engraves it. None of this tidies everything up, and I don't want to pretend that it does. The experiment caught the slow motion of fear red-handed and showed it to be memory. But it didn't abolish the inner clock, which really does exist for the ticking of seconds and minutes, and really is swayed by dopamine. The engineer's elegant frame rate idea remains, for all its reach, mostly a guess. It has very little hard evidence behind it, and has been largely left alone by the people who study time for a living. And beneath all of it sits the uncomfortable thing we ran into at the start of the night. When you actually measure the speeding up, it comes out smaller than it feels. So the honest state of the science is not a verdict. It is a room full of rival clocks, and no agreement at all about which of them, if any, is the one that's truly running. But notice the thread running quietly through the whole night, because it is the strangest thing here. Every time we go hunting for the clock, the physical thing that simply must be speeding time up, we arrive at the spot where it should be and find something else standing there instead. We went looking for arithmetic and found memory. We went looking for a sped-up brain inside a falling body and found memory again, already there, doing its work after the fact. The clock keeps not being where we left it. What keeps being there is the one who does the remembering, and that ought to make us suspicious, this late, of the very question we began with. We have been asking how fast the clock runs, but if every time we pry open the case we find a rememberer and no clock, then perhaps the thing we've been calling the speed of time was never a reading taken off any instrument, and we have been carefully measuring something we never stopped to name. Let the falling feeling go now if it came back to you while we were down there on the stairs. You are not on the stairs. You are lying still, and whatever your heart did for a moment, it is free to slow again. Feel the weight of you settling deeper into the mattress, the small unclenching along the jaw, the breath drawing out long and unhurried. There is no fall here, only the bed and the dark, and a question that has quietly changed its shape while your body was busy bracing for an impact that never came. And this is where the chase runs gently out of road. All night we have been treating time as a thing with a speed, something that could in principle be clocked the way you'd clock a runner, and asking only why it seems to be running faster. We never stopped for the prior question, the stranger one that has to come first and almost never does. Before you can say how fast time is moving, you would have to know what it is that's moving. You would have to know what time even is. And the people who have stared longest and hardest at exactly that question did not come back holding a clock. They came back with something far harder to hold and far closer to home. One of them lived 16 centuries ago, and we still say his name, Augustine. He was a bishop in a North African town, and somewhere around the year 400 he was writing the strangest of books. A long, unguarded letter addressed directly to God, full of confession and argument and wonder. About 2/3 of the way through it, he runs straight into the problem of time, and it stops him cold. He sets down the sentence that nearly everyone since has quoted, because it is so honest it almost stings. What, then, is time? He asks. If no one asks me, I know. If I want to explain it to someone who asks, I do not know. What floored him is something you can feel for yourself in about 10 seconds if you try to take hold of time directly. Reach for the past, and it isn't there. It's gone. It no longer exists. Reach for the future, and it isn't there either. It hasn't happened yet. All that truly exists is the present, this very instant. And yet, when you try to lay a finger on the present, it has no thickness at all. The moment you notice now, it has already slipped behind you into the past. So the whole of time appears to be built out of two things that don't exist, and a third with no width to stand on. And still we measure it without a second thought. We say, a long afternoon, a short year. How do you measure something that, looked at closely, is barely there? Here is where most retellings stop, with the lovely paradox and a shrug. But Augustine didn't stop. He pushed past the puzzle to an answer that still feels, 1600 years on, ahead of its time. If time can't be found out there in the world, he reasoned, then it must be somewhere else, in the mind. We don't measure the past out in the world, we measure it in memory. We don't hold the future out there, we hold it in expectation. And the present is simply our attention, the narrow beam of notice that turns what we expect into what we remember. Time, for Augustine, is not a feature of the universe at all. It is a stretching of the soul. He called it distentio animi. The mind pulled taut across past, present, and future, holding all three at once. And the thing that lengthens or shortens when a year races by or an afternoon yawns open is not the world. It is that stretch. It is you. It's worth remembering how he asked all of this. Not from a lectern. The whole inquiry is addressed to God, half argument and half prayer. He is not announcing that he has solved time. He is admitting on his knees that it bewilders him and asking for help to see it more clearly. He never did claim to have caught it. What he found was a better place to stand inside the confusion, which is a humbler and more durable thing than an answer. 1500 years later, coming at it from an entirely different direction, a French philosopher arrived at a strikingly similar place. His name was Henri Bergson, and around the turn of the 20th century, he was the most famous philosopher alive. People filled lecture halls to hear him the way they would later fill concert halls. Bergson drew a sharp line between two kinds of time. There is the time of the clock, time chopped into identical seconds and minutes and laid out in a row like beads on a string, every unit interchangeable with the next. That is the time of science and train timetables, and it is enormously useful. But it is not, he insisted, the time we actually live in. The time we live in he called durée, lived duration, and it has no identical units at all. It flows, it swells and thins. It refuses to be cut into equal pieces because every moment is coloured by all the moments leaning into it. He had a homely little example for it. Suppose you want to stir sugar into a glass of water. You can know in clock terms more or less exactly how long it will take to dissolve, but knowing doesn't help you in the slightest. You still have to wait, and the waiting cannot be hurried by so much as a second. That waiting, Bergson said, is not the abstract time of physics, which wouldn't care whether the dissolving took an instant or a century. The waiting coincides with your impatience. It is lived, undergone, felt from the inside, your own duration, dripping past at exactly its own rate. You know this in your body every time you stand over a kettle that refuses to boil or wait for a reply that will not come, and the clock and your own skin disagree completely about how long it has really been. The clock keeps one kind of time. You are busy living another. This idea that lived time is the real one and the clock a useful fiction carried Bergson straight into the most famous mind of the age. In the spring of 1922, in Paris, he and Albert Einstein faced one another across a room full of philosophers. Einstein had just overturned everyone's picture of time itself. He had shown that even the clock's time is not fixed, that it stretches and slows depending on how fast you travel and how much gravity you are standing in. Time, the physicist had proved, was stranger than anyone had dreamed. Bergson rose to argue that physics, for all its brilliance, had still left something out, that the lived time of durée was real in a way the equations could never reach. Einstein's reply was brief, and it was devastating. There are only two times, he said, the time of the physicist and the time of the psychologist. There is no separate time of the philosopher. Lived time was not some third, deeper reality. It was merely psychology, a private feeling, soft and unmeasurable, of no real concern to the science of the universe. The world sided with Einstein. Physics had won. Bergson's star fell, and lived time was quietly filed away as merely psychological, the lesser of the two. But notice the small sleight of hand tucked inside that word, merely. Yes, durée is psychological. It is also the only time you have ever once been inside. You have never, in your entire life, experienced a single second of the physicist's time directly, not for an instant. Every moment you have ever lived, every afternoon that yawned wide, and every year that vanished, happened in lived time, in the stretching of your own soul. The clock's time is real, of course. It runs the trains. It is the same for everyone. It does not bend to your mood. And lived time is just as real. It is the only stuff your actual life is made of. Neither one cancels the other out. They are simply two different countries, and we have spent this whole night trying to explain the weather in one of them by poring over the maps of the other. This is what philosophy does at its best, in a way the science could not. It improves the question. We came in asking why the clock seems to speed up, and we leave suspecting that the clock was never measuring our life in the first place, that the thing growing shorter was never out there on the wall at all, but here, in the soul's own quiet stretching. That is not a smaller confusion than the one we walked in with. It is a better one. We have finally started being confused about the right thing. There is almost certainly a clock somewhere in the room with you right now, glowing on a phone, blinking from some small machine, ticking on a table in the dark. It is keeping perfect time, wholly indifferent to you, slicing the night into equal seconds it will never once feel. And you are lying here, keeping the other kind entirely, the time that stretched unbearably through some childhood afternoon and is pouring away faster now, the time made of memory and attention and the slow unspooling of one ordinary night. So there are two clocks keeping time in this dark room. One of them rests on the table, exact and untroubled. The other one is you, and it is the only clock your life was ever truly measured by. Time is a river, and you are standing on the bank. That is how nearly all of us hold it, without ever once deciding to. The water flows past or through you, or away, carrying off the years, and you stand there watching it go. Or time is sand running out of a glass. Or it is something slipping through your fingers no matter how tightly you close them. Different pictures, the same hidden architecture every time. You, still and standing apart, while time moves and you lose it. But look closely, because there is something impossible folded into that picture. To stand on a bank and watch a river go by, you would have to be somewhere the river is not. A patch of dry ground outside the water, a place outside time, some still moment that isn't itself moving from which to watch all the moving moments stream past. And no such place exists. You cannot step out of time to watch yourself lose it. So who is standing on the bank? Who is the still one, the watcher the years are supposedly rushing past and leaving behind? A teacher in 13th century Japan built an entire vision of the world around taking that question seriously. His name was Dogen, D-O-H-Gen, and he noticed that we speak of time as though it were a thing separate from us, a current we are caught in, a substance we are spending down. He thought this was not merely sad but mistaken, a basic error about what we are. There is no you on one side and time on the other, he argued. You are not in time the way a fish is in water. You are time. He made a word for it, uji, O-G, usually rendered as being time, The claim that to exist and to be time are one and the same thing. The mountain is time, the pine is time, and you, lying here in the dark, are time. Not something time is happening to, but a stretch of time itself, briefly taking this shape. He put it in a line that takes a moment to land. Do not think, he wrote, that time merely flies away. Do not imagine that flying away is the only thing time does. Because if time simply flew off and left you behind, then you and time would have to be two separate things, and you are not. The reason the passing of time feels like a robbery, he is saying, is that we have imagined ourselves standing apart from it, on that bank that was never there, watching our own life sail away downstream. Take away the bank, and what is left is not loss. It is only time, being itself as you. This grows out of older Buddhist ground, and it is worth being precise about that ground, because it usually gets flattened into a gentle slogan about living in the moment. The real claim is far stranger and more demanding. It starts with impermanence, in the old word anicca, anicca, the observation that nothing whatever holds still, not the mountains, and least of all, the self. And it presses further into what later thinkers called momentariness, the idea that what looks like a solid, continuous world is actually a rapid succession of momentary flashes, each one arising and vanishing in an instant, the way a flip book's still pages, riffled fast enough, pretend to be a single smooth motion. On this view, even the you that dreads losing time is not a fixed thing sitting still while the time runs out. That self is one of the flashes too, a rising and passing moment by moment, made of precisely the same flowing it is so afraid of. There is no still observer for time to be stolen from. The one who would be robbed is also the river. And from China, centuries earlier, a third voice came at the same knot from another angle entirely. Zhuangzi was less interested in dissolving the self than in dissolving the ruler we measure a life against. He pointed at the morning mushroom which lives less than a day and knows nothing of the month, at the summer cicada which knows nothing of spring and autumn, and then at an ancient tree said to count 8,000 years as a single spring and 8,000 more as a single autumn. To the mushroom, its few hours are a whole life, complete and not in the least short. To the tree, our 80 years are the mushroom's afternoon. There is no view from nowhere, Zhuangzi is saying, no absolute yardstick against which a life comes out long or tragically brief. Each duration is total from the inside. The panic that you are not getting enough time quietly assumes there is some correct amount you were promised, and that figure exists nowhere but in the fear that invented it. You can test this whole strange family of claims yourself, right now, in the dark. Try to catch the present moment. Not think about it. Catch it, hold it still, pin the now in place so you can turn and look at it. You will find you can't. By the time you've noticed this instant, it has already become the last one. You reach for it and your hand closes on something that has only just left. We met this earlier as a dry paradox about measurement. But feel what it is actually like and something turns over inside it. There is no gap between you and the vanishing moment. The noticing and the vanishing are a single event, and you are not its victim, but its substance. There was never a hand, and never a separate thing held in it. There was only this, happening, as you. It is a strange thing to feel, a loosening that is half enormous relief and half a quiet vertigo, the solid floor of your separateness giving softly way. So the question we have carried all night turns out to have a strange assumption built into its very grammar. How do I keep time from slipping away? It takes for granted that there is an I on the bank and a time in the river, a holder and a thing to be held. Pull those two apart, even for a moment, and the question can no longer keep its shape. It isn't answered so much as dismantled, and a different one rises in its place. When you finally work that old picture open and look through it, the room behind is empty. There was never a bank, nor anyone standing on it, nor a hoard of unspent time pooling somewhere upstream where the lost years were being kept. What remains, once the picture falls away, is simply the going, with no one stranded outside it to count what's gone. So the new question is not how do I stop losing the time? It is closer to this. Who exactly did I think was standing on the bank, and what becomes of the fear once I go looking for them and cannot find them anywhere? There is a reason this is easier to feel now than it would be at noon. The separate self, the busy, defended I that holds itself apart from everything and keeps anxious count of what it is losing, is precisely the thing that loosens as you fall asleep. You can feel it going soft at this hour. The boundary between you and the passing night thinning out, the watcher on the bank quietly losing its outline. For a little while, on the edge of sleep, you stop being someone the night is happening to and become, almost, just the night happening. None of those teachers were describing a mystical state reserved for the few. They were describing something you do every single night, on the way down into the dark, and yet the fear has not actually left the room. You can follow every step of this, the bank that isn't there, the self woven out of the same flowing, the now you cannot hold because you are it. And some older, far less philosophical part of you is still lying here, quietly certain that the years are going, and that it matters terribly. The argument dissolved the self. It did nothing at all to the dread. The body, it turns out, did not read the book. And that stubborn, unconvinced fear, the one that outlives even the most beautiful reasoning, deserves a hearing of its own, not to be cleverly argued away, but to be met head-on, taken seriously on its own terms, by someone willing to sit with it and refuse to look away. There is a particular kind of lost time that has nothing to do with childhood, and you have probably had a week of it recently. You were not idle. If anything, you were busy the whole time, answering and arranging and getting through, keeping the various plates in the air. And yet here you are at the end of it, and when you try to find the week, to lay a hand on any single hour of it, there is almost nothing there. Wednesday is a blank. You were present for all of it, technically, and absent from very nearly every minute. The week didn't vanish because it was empty. It vanished because you were never quite inside it. Follow the dread down, past all the talk of clocks and brains and rivers, and you arrive at something simpler and worse than a short life, the suspicion that most of your days go by with you somewhere else entirely, planning the next thing while the present one happens, rehearsing a worry, half watching, getting through. We have spent the whole night hunting for what speeds time up, and the most honest answer may turn out to be the least mechanical one of all, that time feels fast when you are not there for it. An hour you are genuinely inside is long and full. An hour you spend a few steps ahead of yourself in your own head is gone before it has finished happening. Someone sat with exactly this almost 2,000 years ago and refused to look away from it. His name was Seneca, a Roman, a statesman, a playwright, fabulously rich, tangled up in the politics of emperors in a way that would eventually cost him his life. And in the middle of that crowded, powerful, distracted existence, he wrote a short and surprisingly fierce little book, a long letter really, to a friend named Paulinus. We translate its title as On the Shortness of Life. But the argument inside it runs almost exactly opposite to what the title leads you to expect. It is not, Seneca says, that we have been handed a short time to live. It is that we waste so much of what we were given. Life is long enough and generously sized for accomplishing the greatest things, if only the whole of it were well spent. Instead, we let it pour through our fingers on things that don't matter and people who don't matter, and worst of all, on postponement, the endless deferral of living to some later, more convenient date. We are forever getting ready to live. The greatest waste of a life, he writes, is exactly this putting of it off. It robs us of each day as it arrives and steals the present away by dangling the future. It is worth pausing to correct something here, because Seneca has come down to us, unfairly, as one of those grim Stoics, cold, detached, forever teaching us to feel less and want nothing. The man on the page is nothing of the sort. He is urgent, very nearly angry and wholly on the side of life. He is not telling Paulinus to care less about his days. He is telling him to stop standing by while they are stolen. Stoicism, in his hands, is not a numbing at all. It is a kind of ferocious attention to the one thing you can never, ever be given back. To feel the full discomfort of the letter, stand in Paulinus's sandals as it arrives. You are an important man. You run the grain supply for the entire city of Rome. You keep 1 million people fed, weighty work, the kind that earns respect and never quite ends. And a friend who loves you has just sent you a letter that says, with great affection and absolutely no mercy, you are spending your one life on everyone's business but your own. You keep promising yourself you'll get to your real life later, when the work eases, when you retire, when things finally settle down. He wants you to see that the settled day you are waiting for is a fiction, and that the waiting itself is where your life is quietly going. You are not living, the letter says. You are only ever about to. And of course it was never really about Paulinus or about Rome. You do this, I do this. We promise ourselves we'll be present once the deadline passes, once the children are older, once the house is finally sorted, once things calm down, and the calm never comes because there is always one more item standing between you and it. The peace is forever one task away, which is only a gentler way of saying it is nowhere. And here the oldest wisdom and the newest evidence reach across 2,000 years and shake hands. Remember the loose thread from earlier, that when researchers went looking for what best predicts the feeling of time racing, age itself kept losing to something else. This is the something else. The strongest signal was never how old people were, it was how rushed they felt. The ones for whom time flew were not necessarily the oldest. They were the ones who felt most hurried, most pressed, most perpetually behind. Which means the acceleration you have been blaming on the years may be, in large part, the simple sensation of a life moving past someone too busy to be inside it. Now I have to be careful here because I can feel exactly where this wants to slide, and I suspect you can too. It wants to become a poster, be present, live in the moment, put down the phone and seize the day. And the trouble with all of that, beyond the fact that it's printed on 1,000 mugs, is that it quietly turns presence into one more task. One more line on the list, one more thing to do well and feel guilty about doing badly. Be more present becomes just another deadline you are already behind on. That is not what Seneca is offering, and the cheap version of him is worth refusing. He isn't handing you a productivity tip, and he isn't telling you to optimize your leisure or frantically collect experiences so you'll have more to look back on later. That frantic collecting, the photographing of every moment so it can be saved for some future viewing, is only absence wearing a more anxious face. The point was never to wring more out of your time. It was simply to be in it. So Seneca doesn't actually want your agreement. It would be easy to agree with him in the abstract, nod at the wisdom, and let the insight itself become one more fine thing you intend to act on later. He wants something far more specific, and he wants it from you tonight. Not the general question of whether life is wasted by hurry, but the particular one. Today, the day that just ended an hour or two ago, were you in it? Not whether you used it well, not whether you got enough done. Those are the list's questions, and they miss the whole point. Were you actually here for any of it, or did it slip by while you were a few steps up ahead bracing for tomorrow? He will not answer that for you. No one can. It isn't a matter for argument, it's a matter for your own quiet verdict in your own real life, and the only place that verdict can be reached is precisely where you already are. You don't have to settle it now. In truth, you can't, not tonight. It isn't that kind of question. You can only carry it down into sleep and let it do its slow work in the dark, the way the truest questions do, asking nothing of you but quietly changing the shape of tomorrow when you wake into it. And perhaps, lying here, you can already feel that even Seneca's fierce and beautiful answer doesn't quite reach the floor of this, because be here for your life is still, faintly, an instruction, and you know by now how instructions go. You'll mean to, and forget, and mean to again. There is something underneath even that, something this whole long night has been circling without ever quite naming. Not a rule to obey or a skill to master, but a question that may be worth more to you carried than answered, and that is the thing left to sit with in the last of the dark. So let's go back to the question we started with hours ago now, the plain one you could have asked before any of this began. Why does time feel faster as you get older? It seemed, when we set out, like a question with an answer waiting somewhere, a mechanism to uncover, a culprit to name, some fact about clocks or brains that would explain the whole strange acceleration and let you sleep. We went looking for that answer in earnest. What we found instead was stranger, and I think better than the answer would have been. Think of everything we turned over along the way. There was the tidy arithmetic, the year shrinking into a smaller and smaller fraction of the life behind it. An idea so neat it has fooled people for a century and a half, and so wrong that the very man who first wrote it down crossed it out in the same breath. There was memory, which came nearer the truth than anything else. Childhood ran slow and deep because it was crowded with first times the mind recorded in detail, and the years thin out now because so many of their days are near copies it doesn't trouble to keep. There was the clock in the body, the real circuitry that counts out seconds and bends under the chemistry of the brain. True enough for minutes, never quite shown to be the thing that runs off with the decades. And there was that long backward fall from the tower, which promised to catch time slowing in the very act, and instead caught only memory, working after the fact, pressing hard on a frightening moment, and fooling us into believing the moment itself had stretched. And underneath all of it, the honest thing, the one I keep returning to. When you stop theorizing and actually measure this, when you ask people of every age to judge a day, an hour, a year, the effect comes out real but surprisingly small, much smaller than the size of the feeling. So I'll tell you plainly where I've landed after all of it. I don't know for certain why time feels faster as you get older, and neither does anyone else, not yet. There's no settled answer waiting at the end of the science, only a room full of partial ones, each true about its own corner, and none of them the whole. And somewhere in the middle of the night, I stopped finding that disappointing, because the not knowing turned out to be a door, and on the far side of it stood a far better question than the one I came in carrying. The people who gave up hunting for the mechanism and asked instead what time even is, they didn't come back holding a clock either. They came back pointing, nearly all of them, at the same place. The bishop who decided time lives in the soul, a stretching of the mind across memory and attention and expectation. The Frenchman who insisted the only time you ever actually inhabit is the lived kind, never the clocks. The teacher who said there is no you standing on the bank watching the river leave because you are the river. The Roman, furious and loving in the same sentence, who said the trouble was never that life is short, but that we are forever absent from it, always just about to begin. 4 different centuries, 4 different tongues, and listen to how they rhyme. Then listen to the memory scientists who came the entirely opposite way by survey and brain scan and washed up on the very same shore. That time feels full when it's thick with what we genuinely noticed, and empty when we weren't there to notice anything at all. Strip the whole night down, and one word is left standing in the middle of the room. The word everything has quietly been circling. Attention. What makes an hour feel like an hour? What makes a year feel like a year? What makes a life feel lived? It was never the length of the thing. It was how much of you was actually present for it. Think back then to that endless childhood summer we started with. It wasn't long because you were young, not exactly. It was long because a child is almost entirely present. Every hour genuinely new, nothing deferred, nowhere else it needs to be. The whole of a small self poured straight into a single afternoon. And the years blur now not simply because you have aged, but because you are so often somewhere else while they go by. The summer was vast because you were all the way inside it. That, in the end, is the difference this whole night has been trying to describe, which is the moment the first question quietly turns into the one it was always hiding. Why does time feel faster was never really a question about time. It was you, noticing that you have not been fully here for much of your own life and missing yourself. The speeding up is the felt shape of your own absence. The years blur because you were elsewhere while they happened, and some honest part of you, lying awake at this hour, knows it and grieves it a little. Where did the time go is the gentlest way the soul has found to ask the harder thing it doesn't quite dare say outright. Where was I while it went? We called time the one thing you can never get back, the resource you can't earn more of. And that's true as far as it reaches. But the night has quietly corrected it. The clock's time was never really yours to lose. It pours out at the same rate for everyone, indifferent and untouchable, no more yours than the weather. The thing that is actually yours, the thing you genuinely spend or fail to spend on this hour and the people inside it, is your attention. That is the true thing you cannot store up and cannot earn back, not the hours, but how much of yourself you bring to them. And here is the small mercy folded into all of it, the reason it isn't only sad. The years behind you are gone, and the week you weren't really in is gone, and none of that returns. But this dark, quiet, unremarkable moment right now is one you could still be here for. The one thing you can never save for later turns out to be the one thing wholly in your hands tonight. And perhaps that is what the question was for all along. Not to be solved, because it can't be, and you can lay down the trying tonight, but to be carried. Some questions aren't obstacles standing in your path. They're instruments, and the work they are built to do is to keep your attention awake. Am I here for my life is one of those. You will never answer it once and be finished. You'll ask it tomorrow and badly and forget it by lunch and ask it again. And that isn't failure, that is the question doing exactly its work. Because a question like this one, carried gently through ordinary days, does the single thing no answer ever could. It keeps turning you back toward your own life while the life is still going on. And a life, in the end, is not measured out in the years it happened to last. It is made of the moments you were actually present for, the quiet sum of all the time you managed to be here. To carry the question is already, a little, to be here. That isn't a solution, and it doesn't pretend to be one. It is something kinder, and it asks far less of you. It only asks that you keep it close. So there is nothing left to settle now. You can let the whole question go soft and let it stay with you at the same time. It knows its own way down into sleep, and it will keep. Notice what your mind has already started to do here at the edge of things. The day is playing itself back, quietly, on its own, small moments rising and sorting themselves, most of them slipping under, a few of them staying. That sorting is the very thing we chased all night. Memory deciding in the dark what was real enough to keep. Let it work. You don't have to help it. The year will feel fast again tomorrow, and that is all right. It was never a thief. It is only the weather of a life, moving the way it moves. The question will still be here when you wake, not as a weight to pick back up, but as a companion, the kind that walks beside you and asks for nothing. Your breathing has already begun to lengthen on its own. The room is dark, the hour is late, and there is, truly, nowhere you need to be but here. Let the time run on ahead without you for a while. It knows the way. Let the day close. Whatever the years are doing out there, they can manage it tonight without your worry. Let yourself sleep now. The question will keep until morning, and so, gently, will you.